was the most successful colony in the Americas. I mean, we think of it today as it's a poorest nation in the Americas. It's always talked about in those terms. At that time, it really was the richest site. It wasn't a nation of its own, but the richest colony in the Americas. The productivity was enormous. So for every, in a sense, empire in the Americas, in a sense, had their eye on it, would have loved to be able to take control of that sector of the economy. The beginning of the revolution happened really in the northern plain of Saint-Domingue, which really was this extremely industrialized zone in which there were these enormous sugar plantations. That's really where the revolution began, and I think that's important to remember as well, that these plantations, which were some of the most industrial sites in the world at the time, in terms of the combination of both agriculture and production, generated this revolution. It came out of these plantations. The first stage of the revolution in 1791 was essentially about the slaves establishing control over these plantation domains. They transformed these wealthy plantations into their camps. One of the most interesting things that African historians have suggested about the revolution is that one of the reasons it may have succeeded is that there were huge numbers of men who had served in armies in Africa, who had been soldiers in Africa, who had been enslaved as a result of after participating in wars in Africa, and they brought their military experience to Saint-Domingue.
1793, Britain and France went to war, and Britain saw a chance to do two things in one go: to seize this very wealthy territory for itself, away from its enemy France, and to suppress the slave revolt before it could spread to Jamaica, which was very close by. A huge British force headed for Saint-Domingue, and for 5 years they fought the rebel slaves there who came under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture, the great Haitian leader, and they lost.
The attempted repression of that revolt involved hundreds of thousands of English boys and young men who were shipped off to Haiti. And there they will meet at the other end of a bayonet or the other end of a machete, the historic indignation of slaves fighting for freedom. And it's a huge trauma to the English people.
This was a case where an army of rebel slaves had defeated the army of the world's superpower, which was also the world's greatest slave trading nation. And it was a great shock.
The same can be said of the French, right, who have also, who later lost against essentially the same troops when they tried to reestablish slavery. The British defeat was, in a sense, presaged the defeat of Napoleon's troops that would follow a few years later. This revolution seemed kind of unthinkable for a lot of thinkers. The idea that this was happening in some ways, the idea that slaves would become generals and leaders of a revolution and would defeat these armies, it was just really hard to kind of fit into what they believed and what they saw. Now, a lot of people, of course, did think about it and brought it into their reality. But I think it challenged at the time and continues to challenge so many of our notions about where history is made, how history is made, who are the central actors in history. This is really one of the foundational moments in the history of not just the Americas politically, but in democratic theorizing, of philosophy, of thinking about what rights are. So not only do you have a challenge to racist ideas that kind of consign people to the margins of history rather than placing them at the center, but you also have to rethink, I think, a lot of broader narratives about Western history.
What's interesting about the Haitian Revolution is that it's the only revolution with the only constitution that outlaws slavery and outlaws discrimination on the basis of race. Now that is historic. That's not in the Bill of Rights in the US. It's not part of the unwritten constitution of the British Empire. But it's part of that history of opposing racism, which actually comes from the enslaved themselves and not from the so-called humanitarian efforts of the abolitionist movement, which couldn't have been successful unless the slaves themselves were making slavery unstable.
The cost they paid for it was a terrible one, because there was this international boycott of Haiti, and in the end they had to pay reparations. So it's not that reparations were paid to the slaves. They had to pay reparations to the French for property expropriated and so forth. One of the reasons that Haiti is today the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere comes out of this, that they do this tremendous historical feat. So here's the only successful slave revolution in history, and basically, we are going to make sure that the contagion of your example does not spread to the United States, does not spread to Latin America. We're going to isolate you, we're going to quarantine you, we're going to make you pay.
Slavery itself isn't abolished in the British Islands until 1833. And indeed, there are still Africans carried across the Atlantic to Cuba and Brazil, illicitly, another more than 1 million. And slavery doesn't end in America till the Civil War. It doesn't end in Cuba and Brazil till 1888.
The sad truth of many situations like this, where there's a huge change on paper, a huge change on paper doesn't change people's material conditions of life. Because what happened was British slaves finally became officially free, August 1st, 1838, but for almost all of them, there was no work available except continuing to cut sugarcane. And now they suddenly found themselves having to pay rent to the planters for the miserable huts that they lived in, and taxes to the government.
And there were also all kinds of other strategies used essentially to prevent former slaves from gaining access to land, to prevent them from gaining access to the cities, to prevent them from gaining access to the professions and so forth. So there were all kinds of other strategies, all of them really largely tied together by a broader racial order that also kind of sustained a certain kind of subordination without slavery.
Many of the abolitionists could see that it was unjust and it was cruel to perpetuate a system where people were enslaved and degraded. But that did not necessarily mean that they saw those people who were degraded and enslaved as civilized like them. So there is a disconnect. And it's a disconnect that has to be marked and given some significance, because historically we often think that abolitionism was like an anti-racist movement. It wasn't an anti-racist movement. You know, Britain moved out of slavery straight into a wider and deeper colonial empire.
I think it's important that the British try and temper their sense of themselves and the sense of their past with an awareness that their history is not all drums and trumpetry. It's not all the kind of glories. It comes with a kind of a rather dark stain to it, a rather dark side to it. What was Rule Britannia about? Written in the 1740s, when Britain did rule the waves, but in the 1740s the British are carrying 40,000 Africans a year across the Atlantic. Never will be slaves. Britain never will be slaves.
Of course, the end of slavery opened up all kinds of possibilities for contestation that simply were not there before. So I think the change was crucial, and ex-slaves mobilized political institutions, legal institutions, religious institutions, and were able to do so and kind of push forward. But it is striking, I think, that in a sense the struggle to really bring about a complete end or complete erasure of all the effects and legacies of slavery is still continuing in a lot of ways.
Chancellor Gordon Brown has come to India to talk about trade and jobs, but instead he's having to reassure his hosts that Britain's not a racist country.
I think we want to send a message, as I know most British people want. We are a nation of fairness and tolerance, and that is how I think most of the world want to understand it.
His fear was that a row about Britain's past, if you like, about attitudes that many people thought should have gone and had gone, might actually hamper our future.